So there's about half that are coming in of the ones that registered, but because of the time, we'll get started. So welcome everyone to our this year's meeting and special symposium entitled Developing Mental Wellness at All Stages in Academia. So as of 2 p.m. today, there were 1,282 attendees at this meeting. That's great. 232 of you had actually registered for the symposium. That's about 5%, and that's great. 37 of you had registered for the theme table, Developing Mental Wellness, which will be facilitated by our guest speakers today, immediately after this symposia, with a 30-minute break in between. And 60 of you had watched the video by Dragonfly called Breaking the Stigma, Cultivating Mental Health as an Academic, which actually interviews several faculty, one of whom is a well-known developmental biologist, former president of the society and former awardee of the Conklin Award. So for each of you that are here, regardless of academic status, to us, you represent a person who is at this meeting, likely because you find it very fulfilling to be at the bench or at your desk learning new things about nature, whether you study plants or animals, but you like the excitement of the scientific endeavor and you love to share it with others in meetings like ours. But there's more to science than just working at the bench. And this is an issue that is definitely very worth talking about because it directly affects all of our scientific endeavors. And the slide reminds me that there are two reminders. So one, again, I just want to repeat theme table number 8. Today between 5 and 6 p.m. will be facilitated by our guest speakers that you will hear at the symposium. And most important for all of us, we're very interested in your questions and answers. And we encourage you to be a full participant of the symposium. And please do not hesitate to enter your comments in Q&A. And my partner in crime, Nicole Theodosiou, who is the chair of the PDNC, will be handling your Q&As. Okay, so as I was saying, actually it's interesting. Since 1949, May, the month of May, has been Mental Health Awareness Month and is recognized worldwide by many organizations. And the goal is to bring awareness, to fight the social stigma, to provide support, educate the public, and advocate for policies that support people with mental illness and their families. Interestingly, all of us academics, we actually don't celebrate it much. And poor mental health among all of us, academics and research, has long before COVID-19 been a problem and a pervasive issue at that. But it's the invisible problem that nobody wants to talk. Fortunately, much has been talked about. Many studies are coming out, and thanks to the social scientists and the anthropologists who are studying us, of those at the bench, for actually bringing these issues to our attention. It's estimated that mental illness among those of us in academia is affecting about 50% of all graduate and professional students suffering from depression and anxiety. Not surprisingly, there's not many numbers about faculty because we remain afraid to come out and talk about it. We're afraid that if we experience mental illness, we will not be successful, or that we will be judged by our peers or mentors. And after all, the life of a professor is a constant balancing act under stress, managing expectations. We work under a hyper-competitive culture, yet it's one of the most fulfilling career paths still to me, but it has become one of the most stressful jobs. And the academic system assumes that we should be old enough, experienced enough, and tough enough to withstand all the pressure that comes with a job. But that's not the case, and it shouldn't be the case anymore. And so in this slide is just showing one of the articles that has made the rounds and has become the most popular to go around. But since even before the 2018 Nature paper, many publications are coming out all around the journals. And we're happy that this is a topic that's being talked about. And it's affecting all of us, not just undergrad students and grad students, but postdocs, staff, as well as faculty. So we should pay attention to that. So why this topic in developmental biology? Why this topic in our society? And I just want to remind all of you of what our mission is. And the last sentence says to promote a fair, respectful, ethical, and equitable practice throughout the scientific enterprise. And to me, that driving message is that our society stands for development for all, where we create an environment where anyone that's interested in developmental biology is welcome, supported, and provided equal opportunity to excel. And I think creating the environment is essential, and especially an environment that has the least stress and optimizes our enjoyment for the science. And so I think that this topic is perfect for our meeting, and we hope that we bring you the symposium in the hope that it helps all of us feel comfortable to start speaking out about mental health challenges in our labs and during our meetings. Now, we are not the experts, and so we research thoroughly, and we're bringing in people that actually are committed to this, who are scientists themselves, and who actually have been talking about this and have organized evidence-based practices to talk to us about it. So the first speaker is Chrissy Stachl. Stachl. Okay, my apologies. So she has a Bachelor of Science from University of UW in Seattle. She then went a little south to UC Berkeley to get a PhD in chemistry. Now, interestingly, she started her PhD working to understand how water molecules vibrate and interact with one another. But during this time, she became very interested in how to make the field of chemistry more diverse and inclusive. And so she actually went hybrid. She started doing the molecules as well as how to have more people in STEM education. So she actually, let me just read to you the title of her dissertation. It is From Water to Human Dynamics, Probing Chemical Systems and Aqueous Nanodrops, Quantifying Graduate Academic Culture and Building Community within an R1 STEM department. And I dare you to, these are two publications from her dissertation, and talk about diverse. So I dare anybody to pronounce effects of temperature on cesium. That's all I know. But she is now, she's the current Director of Education, Outreach, and Diversity at the Center for Genetically Encoded Materials. She started her own consulting firm called Reflecting Equity, which is dedicated to helping academic communities develop best practices to foster diversity and inclusion. And when I asked, given that this symposium is organized by the Inclusion and Outreach Committee, or our IOC, and it is an Olympic year after all, when asked her that given that this Olympic year, what sport does she think her career academics has prepared her the best to compete if she were in the Olympics? She said ice skating, because there's no way to learn how to skate other than by falling and getting back up. So that's perfect. And apparently she knows how to ice skate and probably learned it in Colombia. Okay, our next speaker is actually the founder and CEO of Dragonfly Mental Health. She's originally from Arizona. She did her bachelor's in the University of Arizona. And very much like Chrissy, has been contributing to science with co-authoring manuscripts in chemistry and molecular biology. She then moved on to, she took, I think, some time off between undergrad and grad and continued co-authoring papers, but now more in the neuro realm. She then moved to the West, very good, head west, to UC Berkeley, where she was at the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology. From then on, she worked in a great model system, which I love, but we won't talk about that. She then did a couple of postdocs that were very much more focused on human health. There were more neuro. She did, also from cell lines to humans, studying electric shock therapy. And her last postdoc was in the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins in psychiatric epidemiology. In 2019, she founded Dragonfly Mental Health, which is a nonprofit organization that is specifically focuses on learning more about mental health in academia among academics. And when she was asked what Olympic sport academia has prepared her for, she said the marathon, to which I said, you have a lot of stops in the way. So, but no, that was, one of the things that I wanna say is that when I asked her why Dragonfly, and I do wanna bring this up, and I encourage you to look at their website. But she did talk about how Dr. Chris Alvaro was obtained his PhD in the same department at UC Berkeley. And he himself was a strong advocate and supporter of science, people going into the sciences, as well as a strong supporter of all underrepresented groups to go into the sciences. And due to an unfortunate tragic death, lost to suicide, he himself used a dragonfly as a tattoo on his wrist, which meant hope to him. And Wendy Ingram has taken that up as the logo and the name of the company, of the nonprofit. And so with this, I want to welcome both Wendy and Chrissy with one of my favorite people and her quotes, and that is by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So hopefully you'll make, this helps to make all of our lives more meaningful and for community. Okay. Let me stop sharing and then you can have the floor.
Thank you so much for that warm and thorough and very heartfelt introduction of all of us. Graciela, it's been really a pleasure working with you and the committee to get this organized and make this happen. So we're really excited to be here and hope that the 230 folks that are here, more than that now, will get something out of this too and find this beneficial. So just to confirm, can you only see the main slide, not my presenter view? Looks good. Okay, great. Well, let's make the most of our time. The amazing, wonderful non-compete time of 90 minutes for this entire segment is a boon, is really amazing, and really demonstrates how incredibly important the Society for Developmental Biology is taking mental health of their community. And so I'm so happy to be here, and we hope you'll get a lot out of this. So I want to just jump into initially If you are in crisis or at any point during this talk feel stressed or worried about yourself or about others, please make sure to go ahead and reach out to a 24/7 hotline or call your local emergency services. This web address, iasp.info/resources/crisis centers, is a really nice comprehensive list anywhere you are in the world, which virtual meetings like this allow us to be. Please go ahead and avail yourselves of that. And I do want to start with a disclaimer that Dragonfly Mental Health is not a healthcare provider organization. The information that we're going to provide today does not qualify as medical advice and does not substitute for speaking to medical professionals. However, everything that we do at Dragonfly is evidence-based, extremely well researched, and as Graciela pointed out, in my background, I am a mental health expert and researcher. So we can give that information, but no clinical advice. So what we're going to do today is, I just wanted to give you an outline, is that while we'll kind of skip over the personal introductions a little bit, I'll give Chrissy an opportunity to add a bit if she would like, if there was anything missed. But then what I'll mention is clearly delineate what this talk is and what it's not. We'll talk about the spectrum of mental health, and then the bulk of the talk is going to be me going over some of the basic, most prevalent or most concerning mental illnesses that you might encounter in the academic space. And with that context in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about causes and a little bit about treatments. And if there's a few things specifically about academia, if we do know those things. And then I'm going to hand it over to Chrissy or Dr. Stachl, and she'll be speaking about intersectionality and how other aspects of people's identities and interacts with mental health as well. And then we'll hopefully have quite a bit of time there then after that for some group discussion. So myself, I am a researcher and a mental health advocate, so I won't go into any of the details, but just to summarize, I've been studying the brain and behavior from molecules to populations for 17 years now. And I'm very passionate, I'm very excited about all of the things that we know, as well as the things that we don't know, and very passionate about the amazing work that bench research and basic science research, and asking the right question in the right way and repetitively and with perseverance, we can get to the answers that matter. And so through my PhD work and my postdoctoral work at Johns Hopkins, I ended up leading and creating multiple organizations to address mental health problems among my peers. And now Dragonfly Mental Health is the ultimate, the current manifestation of those efforts. So I'll let Chrissy or Dr. Stachl mention anything else she would like to.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ingram. And Graciela, thank you so much. Just to echo Wendy's comments about our intro and just the warm welcome. Thank you for setting that tone for us. So yeah, I am Chrissy. I got my PhD in chemistry, but I did do a lot of work in education spaces and specifically trying to improve inclusion, belonging, and wellness among graduate communities. So graduate students, postdocs, and faculty. So halfway through my PhD, I worked with the department chair in Berkeley chemistry to help sort of spearhead a longitudinal assessment of our academic climate. And through that sort of data analysis, I found ways to design interventions to make our spaces more inclusive and to prioritize wellness. I fell in love with that work. And so I have a consulting company called Reflecting Equity, which Graciela also introduced, to help academic communities foster best practices to improve their diversity and also be more inclusive to all identities in academic spaces. So excited to be here today and chat with y'all.
Thanks, Dr. Stachl. It's a pleasure to work with you. So now I'll do a brief introduction about Dragonfly. I won't go too deep, but just to elaborate a little bit on the origin story that Graciela shared with you about my friend and colleague, Chris Alvaro. Dr. Alvaro was identified as a non-binary trans person. And so they did use the pronouns they, them. But we are inspired by Chris, all that Chris did during their lifetime. And so what we're doing is, in the tragedy of having lost this amazing member of our community, we're turning pain into action. And action really is honestly my coping mechanism. So this is what I've been doing since we lost that amazing person. And so Dragonfly works in 3 different domains. We have a huge volunteership, over 220 members who contribute to our global consortium for academic mental health, and we conduct primary and secondary research and are trying to address the systemic issues that are facing our communities. We also build community directly. We host 3 free Dragonfly cafes, virtual events a week, and we have been doing so since the beginning of the pandemic. So we welcome any and all members of the community, the academic community, or aspirants, as well as folks who have left academia and have gone on to industry or some other life path. Everyone is welcome at Dragonfly Cafe. It is a safe space for peers to talk to people around the world about mental health and academia. And then finally, the largest piece of what we're doing right now is bringing evidence-based programming directly to campuses and to associations, such as this talk itself. And so we're really trying to engage with communities directly and foster conversation, get people talking to each other, really dig into the underlying and unique conditions within each community we talk to in order to create cultural and climate change within the community itself. So every community is different, and we emphasize 5 domains that involve people, skills, literacy, and fighting stigma, one of which you had an opportunity to watch a video. And if you didn't see that yet, but you'd like to watch that later, it's a short video, but it involves the interviews of many faculty, some of whom you know, Dr. Richard Harlan being one of them. And they talk about their own lived experience and bust the myth that if you struggle with your mental health, you don't have what it takes to be a phenomenal scientist and you belong in academia. So I encourage anyone and everyone to check that video out if and when you have time and interest. So just wanted to highlight a few faces of the many. We now have over 220 volunteers. Graciela is one, Dr. Stachl is one. It's just an incredible community of people that are working together to improve mental health among academics worldwide. So let's get to the talk. Time is of the essence. So this is meant to be just a very, very brief mental health introduction. We're going to touch on just a few of the most relevant health conditions. We don't have time to go deep dive into any one of them, but I'm happy to answer more specific questions during the Q&A if you would like. This is supposed to be the beginning of an ongoing conversation around mental health literacy and culture change. Things do not change with one and done kind of interventions or educational seminars like this. So this is not meant to be lip service and like hands clean, we're done with mental health forever. This is supposed to be the beginning of a much longer, much deeper conversation that needs to be addressed. It is not going to be comprehensive knowledge, and it's not a response training. So we can talk a little bit about that during the Q&A, about what you can do if you think you're struggling or someone else is struggling, but we don't have time to go into that response training today. We do have workshops at Dragonfly available that are 2 or even 3 hours where we do train and build skills and practice those skills. So those are available, but check out our website if you want to learn more about that. And so, just to nail it home, this is not everything you need to know in a nutshell. And what's great is actually in the pre-talk survey, we asked a bunch of questions that over 100 people from this group answered. So you took the time and you answered the questions about some objective knowledge. And so I just wanted to share the answers to these that were given. And the first question was about a prevalence issue. So 16% of people will experience a major depressive episode during their lifetime, true or false. And what we see here is that a lot of people said, I don't know. And that is lack of mental health literacy, that we don't know how prevalent major depression really is. And the answer is that it's true. For the second question about graduate student anxiety, more than 50% experience anxiety symptoms. Overwhelmingly, people thought that this was a true statement. And to some degree, it is. It is a true statement that more than 50% experience symptoms, but not more than 50%, at least in the surveys and the studies that have been done so far, meet criteria for serious to diagnosable anxiety, or maybe indicative of having a full anxiety disorder necessarily. So it was a little bit of a trick question, but a lot of people really recognize that there's a lot of anxiety among graduate students. So at least that is a good self-awareness in our community. The third question was about whether mental illnesses are real medical conditions that are treatable. And the answer is yes. Everyone who said true here was correct. These are all treatable conditions that I'm going to be talking about today. The last two questions were about the interaction between substance use disorder and mental health. And you were correct in saying that the statement that we had in that questionnaire was false, that the statement, for those who didn't see the survey, was how that substance use disorder doesn't tend to co-occur with mental illness. And that's just patently false. There's a lot of co-occurrence. And then the fifth and final objective piece of information question that we asked in that was whether there are certain segments of the population that are just immune to mental health struggles. And that statement is also false. No one is immune. Everyone is susceptible. So I just wanted to touch on that and reflect some of the answers that people in your own community shared with us at the beginning and engaged in. So you do have quite good mental health literacy on these particular topics off the get-go. So I also asked a couple questions about your community's experience of mental health struggles directly. So not of the individuals, but we asked questions of, do you know someone who's struggled with their mental health in your community, in academia? And 99% of people said yes. So this is something that everyone knows someone that has struggled with their mental health. And the second question that I asked about this was, do you know someone who struggled with suicide, died by suicide, or attempted suicide? And this is one of the most shocking, but really unfortunately not surprising percentages and responses we've ever gotten. Is nearly 80% of people who answered this survey know someone that they know has struggled with suicidal ideation, has attempted suicide, or has died by suicide. And the fact is that anyone dying by suicide and the experience of struggling with suicidality are really, really big, heavy issues. And this affects both the people who are experiencing them as well as their entire community, everyone who knows about it. And so this is really important that we become more adept, even if we're not the ones struggling with it, to know how to recognize and how to support people who do. So the last question, I wanted to just share some stats with you, since we're all numbers-minded type folks, is I asked a question about how COVID-19, how the pandemic was affecting your mental health. And this is a question about the person themselves, not just do they know someone who was negatively or positively affected. And we see that overwhelmingly the people who responded to this survey said that yes, COVID-19 negatively affected their mental health. And this is by far one of the largest percentages that indicated that of any group that we've interacted with so far. And over time there may be an effect here, in that we're at the end of the pandemic, or at the end of at least the first year of it, and there's a lot more time for the pandemic to negatively affect people's mental health. But just to indicate, a lot of people are struggling. A lot of people were struggling before the pandemic, as Graciela pointed out with the Evans Nature 2018 paper. And so I just want to let folks know that are feeling the stress and may not realize, you are not alone. There's a lot of other people in your community that are struggling too. So I always like to start mental health literacy talks touching on the mental health spectrum. So mental health is not some thing that just is binary, yes or no. You're mentally healthy or you're not. I assume most people agree with me and already knew that and felt that way, but I did want to point out a few points along that spectrum and a little bit about them. So mentally healthy individuals are going to be people who are doing really well, generally happy or content at least, and things aren't bothering them in that day, in that moment. But this goes away for a lot of people very quickly and very regularly, and this is normal and natural to experience stress. Unless you live in a bubble, which actually would stress me out, as COVID has stressed many people out over the last year by having to live in bubbles, you're going to experience stress of various sorts. And engaging in the academic pursuits that we all are, that is something that's going to be even higher for us at a naturally higher level than maybe some other career choices we could have made. So stress is a state where you're activated, you're not exactly happy and content, there's some stuff going on, but it's very easy to get back to that mentally healthy state once the stressor has gone away and been alleviated or dealt with. Distress is the next level. That's where normal levels of stress are you've crossed a boundary. It's no longer normal. This is an amount of, when you're in a distress state, it may take more than just time or, a quick remedy, head to yoga real quick and okay, shake it off. Now you're back to a mentally healthy state. A distress state is something that it may be weighing on you more. It may be harder to shake off, and you might actually benefit from more intensive approaches, more time off, something more than typical normal stress would require to get back to that mentally healthy state. And distress is important to differentiate from disease, diagnosable. If you go to your doctor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, they can go through an entire diagnostic and diagnose you with a mental illness of some sort. So it's a little bit different, important to delineate between those two. But again, this is all a spectrum. There is no super hardcore line between the two. So it can be hard, especially in that distress to disease end of the spectrum, where you are there. And that's where going to a doctor, getting diagnosed, getting help, determining what's going on for you, what are the causes, and what are the treatment solutions and options you have. That's a good time to be going to somebody to get that expert opinion. And then crisis. Crisis is a point where unfortunately, far too many of us are familiar with the suicidality, having those serious thoughts, attempting suicide, dying by suicide, like my friend Chris. That Chris was in crisis, and we unfortunately lost Chris. Mental illness is a potentially lethal disease, and it's something that needs to be dealt with way earlier in the spectrum, if at all possible. So the rest of this talk is really going to focus on disease. So I'm going to start with the number one question I get all the time is actually, what makes it a disease? How do you define that differentiation between distress and disease? And it's a very good question. And it's something that we can actually break down into 3 major points for any mental illness in general. And you can still get the feeling for it without knowing this very specific symptomology of each and every mental illness. So each mental illness has their own set of symptoms, and the symptoms have to be consistent for more than a reasonable time. So it does not have to be constant. That's a point that's really important to make, but it does usually tend to be more days than not. So you can have a good day in the middle of a depressive episode, and that doesn't mean that you no longer meet criteria for that diagnosable disease of a major depressive episode. And then what typically is true is that it's usually longer than 2 weeks, but a lot of mental illnesses and the symptoms of those can last many, many months, if not even years sometimes, that people will live with these symptoms. So the second point is that these symptoms must represent a significant change in the person's normal experience upon onset. So for folks who had depression come on when they were teenagers, might actually have a little confusion as to when did this start, or is this just my personality? That is where, again, you would want to go seek some professional help in order to differentiate and delineate what's normal, what's treatable, what's something you can do. But it does have to be a change in someone's normal personality. And then the third really, really critical piece about what makes a mental illness a disease is that it affects social, occupational, educational, or other important functioning negatively, and by these changes in the symptomology. So the main points to take away, though, is before we get into any specific illnesses, illness overviews, is that all mental diseases are real biologically and environmentally driven illnesses. They can be episodic, they can be chronic, or they can be a singular event that only happens once. They are often preventable, and all of them are highly treatable. You can engage with care that I'll mention some of throughout this talk, that you can interact with them. That's the main thing to take away. You don't have to live with it. You can live a better life and have a mental disease and still be a mentally healthy person with intervention. And then the third piece is that critical to mentally healthy climate and culture is access to care, but also community support. And that's what really differentiates mental illnesses from many other kinds of physical illnesses, is that individual resilience, individual care is not enough for mental illnesses. You really have to be among people who understand you, understand what you're going through, and are willing to support you. So mood disorders and anxiety. This is the first topic, and I could talk about this for days. In fact, we have a full hour seminar just on depression, which is one of the mood disorders. And so depression and bipolar disorder, which is sometimes is characterized by having a depressive side of that bipolar, is the depression there. You have depression and mania. Depression and bipolar disorders are called mood disorders together in a group. And then anxiety I lumped in here too, because it's highly comorbid, although it can exist alone. And so going to baseline prevalence, point prevalence, not lifetime, like we talked about in the survey, of 16% of people will experience a major depressive episode at some point in their life. If you interview just anyone in a given room, of the general population, you would see about 6.7% meeting criteria for a mood disorder and about 6% meeting criteria for a anxiety disorder. And that's in the general population. But what we see from the emerging evidence, and this is drawn from the Evans paper, is that that percentage is 6 to 8 times higher among academics. Specifically, they were interviewing graduate students. So instead of 6.7% depressed, it was 39%. That is very, very high, and 41% having a serious anxiety symptomology. And so I talk about mood disorders. I always want to emphasize that mood disorders underlie 80 to 90% of suicides. So when we want to take care of people in our community, like Dr. Chris Alvaro, and prevent them from losing them to suicide, we really need to, in a lot of the cases, the vast majority of the cases, recognize and help them seek care, effective care for mood disorders. That's typically what's going on. So 80 to 90% of suicides are preventable by treating the underlying mood disorder. It's the most effective way to prevent suicide. Another point is that restricting means of lethal means and avoiding substance use is also really important in suicide prevention. So the symptoms, again, many different things. It's not just feeling sad or depressed in the classic binary view of what depression looks like. It can affect your mood, it can affect body and behavior, and it affects your thoughts and implants these invasive, intrusive thoughts about believing that you belong, you're better off not being here. Those are very serious thought disorders that cause problems for individuals experiencing mood disorders and anxiety. The causes are myriad as well. And so this, I would, anyone who's, especially the cell developmental biology group, I would highly recommend you check out the depression, scientist primer on depression on the Dragonfly YouTube channel. We have an entire talk where I dig into some of the more of the details of the symptoms and the causes on depression. And a lot of these are similarly related in the other mood disorders and anxiety. But just to list them out, the immune and endocrine dysfunction, nutrition, sleep, or exercise deficiency, and then serotonergic pathways, genetics, and a big component of risk factor is trauma. And so I'll emphasize that suffering with a mood disorder does not preclude you from being a phenomenal researcher and academic member. Professor Kay Redfield Jamison wrote a memoir about herself and her experience with bipolar disorder, An Unquiet Mind, and it's beautiful, it's amazing, and she is a phenomenal researcher at Johns Hopkins. So the next one is burnout. And the big emphasis here with burnout is it's different than depression. It's different than just anxiety. And the main thing is that it's almost always work related. And so the symptoms of burnout in comparison to depression and anxiety is that, and they can look a little bit similar sometimes, but the main pieces are emotional or physical exhaustion, reduced resilience and adaptability. A really big component is cynicism, feeling cynical about work and colleagues, and reduced performance and concentration. The causes are also now really well known, and it's chronic stress relating to work and other ongoing activities, and lack of control, bullying or toxic work environments and relationships, and a big piece that's kind of this ubiquitous thing that we academics usually chalk up as not something is even achievable is work-life balance, or work-life imbalance causes it. What we know, though, that actually helps and will let us get over burnout and come back to work full force with energy and creativity again is taking breaks or vacation, negotiating better hours, accommodations, or communication at work, seeking support and building better relationships in that work environment. And then things like mindfulness, sleep, and exercise really improve burnout. Whereas if those things aren't working for you and and you've addressed the root causes of potential burnout, it might be something more severe like depression, diagnosable depression, bipolar disorder, or anxiety, which you would want to seek clinical care for. So the next one is psychosis. And the symptoms of psychosis are disconnected from reality, bizarre behavior, delusions, hallucinations, chronic or incoherent speech and writing. And it's a very rare disease to have, suffering from something like schizophrenia, which is a psychotic disease. Only about 1% of the population will have a schizophrenic episode or meet criteria for schizophrenia in their lifetime. However, it's one of the most disturbing things to experience, and not just people with a pure psychotic illness will experience. People struggling with depression or bipolar disorder can also have psychotic symptoms, and it can be very, very disturbing to experience them and to see them in your colleagues. And so this is one that I want to bring up and demystify a little bit and destigmatize, because a lot of the causes are genetic for schizophrenia, or specifically schizophrenia, where about 50% of the predisposition is heritable. It's through the genes in some way, shape, or form, whereas about 50% is from environmental triggers. So it's not a one and done kind of thing. What can also cause it are extreme sleep disturbances, as well as substance use or withdrawal from certain substances. And like I said, it can be accompanied by, it can accompany other disorders like mania, borderline personality disorder, and the like. So the thing that I want to really emphasize here is that while it can seem really scary and it can be very disruptive to one's life, it is something that's treatable. It is absolutely treatable. And there are many people who receive treatments like antipsychotics, psychodynamic therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, are able to be back in that mentally healthy state and engage in academia and in their research and their work. And one example of this is Ellen Sachs, who wrote a memoir called The Center Cannot Hold. She's a professor down in LA. So the next one I'm going to emphasize, we asked about in that pre-talk survey, the substance use disorders. And so this is a really big one because I don't know if, this is still the case, but when I was in grad school, there was a very, very heavy drinking culture. And this can be extremely problematic for the folks who are predisposed to developing a substance use disorder. So symptoms are daily use, binge behavior, so drinking a ton, maybe you don't drink at all during the week or partake in a substance during the week, but you do basically use your entire weekend in order to binge on whatever that substance is. If someone's experiencing blackouts, that's a serious symptom. Lying about your use, if you're asked about, hey, did you go out and drink yesterday? And you are lying to your friends, your family, your colleagues, that's a sign that this is now a disordered behavior. Cravings or use impacting your work, your relationships, your friendships, and your mental and physical health too. It's a two-way street here. They feed into each other. And the causes are actually, I really want to destigmatize this as much as I possibly can. It's hugely genetic. There's 40 to 60%, depending on the studies that you point to specifically, is pointing to genetics. So this is something that people have a predisposition to. It's not weakness. It's not personal choice necessarily. It's an interaction between the genetics and the environment, their biology and what they're being exposed to. And a lot of people will use substances as coping behavior, or sometimes call it inaccurately self-medication for some other mental illness that they might be having, or some other stress in their life. And so social pressures and easy access lead to this dependence for a chunk of people. And they can't just stop without more intervention. And it is, like I said, linked to other mental illnesses. And so what helps is that detoxification programs, support groups to maintain sobriety, and individual or group counseling and peer support is absolutely effective in treating substance use disorders. So it is super, super treatable, and most well treatable when you identify and also treat a co-occurring mental health disorder if they have one of those, as well as the mental health disorder that is substance use disorder. So the last three things that I'm going to talk about have earlier onset sometimes. So obsessive compulsive disorder, the symptoms are a strong urge to perform certain routines or rituals, the compulsion, and unwanted repetitive thoughts or intrusive fears. This is what the obsession is referring to. People can spend up to hours a day performing physical or mental rituals, and this can lead to avoidance of triggers and avoiding people in general. And the causes are, again, a lot of genetics, a lot of trauma, brain structural differences have also been identified. All of these interacting and potentially leading to the manifestation of OCD. And while only about 1% of the general population meets criteria for OCD at some point during their life, some studies have shown that about 3.5% of folks in certain groups, this study was done in engineers, so it might be a little bit higher of a percentage among academics. And what helps is cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure and response prevention, and certain SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so I do want to point you towards Dr. Nadine Muller, who openly talks about her OCD and how it affects her as an academic on her website, nadinemuller.org. So the last two are things that manifest when someone's young initially, although it's not always diagnosed when they're young, especially if they are high IQ and high functioning. So for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, there are three different subtypes: hyperactive, inattentive, and combined. And again, this is kind of a spectrum, so it's not necessarily very black and white that people fit into these boxes. But the symptoms must be present since childhood. So if you haven't been diagnosed as an adult, but you now are starting to get that, you will be asked about your childhood, and they may retrospectively look and find evidence of things that maybe you just compensated really well for as a child. But it involves difficulty focusing, especially on people speaking, or if something's boring to the individual, that can really make it hard to focus. Easily distracted, misplacing things, hyper-focus and perseverance on that task, trouble acting even when the intention is there, and trouble managing time, being restless or fidgety. And the causes have been found to be about 75% heritable, potentially very polygenic, so involving a lot of different genes within the genome, and also involving or requiring environmental factors that may trigger the development of ADHD. And what helps is medication. So there's two different kind of medications that are used: stimulants and non-stimulants, and environmental supports, skills training, and psychotherapy to support living with the condition is really, really helpful in reducing frustration and negative self-talk. So only about 30 to 50% of children, depending on the studies you're looking at, grow out of it. So about 6% of children will meet criteria, but 2.5% of adults will meet criteria for ADHD. And so autism spectrum disorder is, again, all of these can have their own 1 to 2 hour seminars on them. But just to touch on it, autism is a complex developmental condition that involves persistent challenges in social interaction, speech, and nonverbal communication, and restricted or repetitive behaviors. And the causes are found about a quarter seem to be involve novel mutations, meaning that about 3/4 are either multigenic or the risk really isn't fully fleshed out yet. We don't understand autism, the cause of autism, very well, except for the fact that vaccines do not cause autism. That is abundantly clear, just to make sure that that gets taken home. What helps is medication to treat any symptoms that you might also experience. So people on the autism spectrum tend to have higher rates of depression, ADHD, OCD, and anxiety. And so psychotherapy, occupational and educational therapy, and sensory integration therapy are all really important things. One of the most famous academics and researchers and professors, Temple Grandin, is talked about in An Anthropologist on Mars by Oliver Sacks, and just is an inspiration for people in the autism spectrum that you can make major, amazing contributions. You just need to engage with the condition and get treatment that helps you cope with that and do well. So mental disease is highly treatable. So 80% of major depressive episodes respond to standard treatment, according to the American Psychological Association. So I just want to emphasize that particular one because it is the most common. But the big thing that Dragonfly really focuses on is that others maybe don't, is that awareness, early identification, and early treatment are incredibly key. The average person waits 6 to 8 years to seek treatment. And this is just so tragic, because the longer you wait, the more complicated the disorder is. And often there's other complicating things. You might develop a substance use disorder on top of your depression. And this just complicates and slows down the recovery process once you do engage in care and treatment. And then finally, community support and encouragement is hugely impactful for seeking care and sustained treatment engagement. We know this from the data, from the literature, from the research that has been done. So I encourage you all, I commend you all actually for having engaged in this talk and being here, because this really is the first step, is knowing and caring and improving your mental health literacy around this in order to see it in yourself and others. And so now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Stachl, who is going to talk about mental health and the Borderlands.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Ingram, for that amazing first half of the talk. I'm going to add a little bit to that sort of the conversation about mental health and specifically how it additionally impacts academics, and talk a little bit about intersectionality. And I like this word, the Borderlands, that I heard recently from a colleague, because it sort of encompasses the identities that have been historically marginalized and sort of helps depict it as like being on a borderland, being on the outskirts of sort of the, dominant, or what we think of as stereotypical identities for scientists. And so some of these historically marginalized populations include BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color, the LGBTQ community, first-gen scientists, those with disabilities, people who come from international communities, so either come to train during their PhD from other countries or come and be faculty, so that cultural difference, and then women who have been also historically excluded from science. And so I bring these up because having identities that are seen as non-dominant in science, or not what a scientist typically looks like in that stereotype, can contribute additionally to mental illness. And so this plot in the middle is from the Substance Abuse and Medical Health Services Administration. And it's sort of showing how race and ethnicity can impact mental illness. And so you can see that African, Indian, or Alaskan Native populations and those who have 2 or more identities have the highest rate of mental illness. This data was collected between 2008 and 2012. And then something that I want to point out is that this data shows that white identifying individuals have a higher rate of mental illness than Black or African American individuals, Asians, and Hispanic individuals. And the thing that I want to highlight about this is that even though they do, white identifying individuals do identify as having more mental illness in general, or higher frequency of it, those who identify as Black, Asian, or Hispanic have more persistent mental health disorders, partly because they are less likely to seek out or receive treatment. And so that's a really huge disparity that is important to address. And then just to highlight some data that are not represented in that plot. So the LGBTQ plus community, those individuals are twice as likely as heterosexual individuals to have a mental health disorder at some point in their lifetime. And that data is from the American Psychological Association. So one of the things that contributes to these mental health issues in marginalized communities is microaggressions. And if you're not familiar with this term, these microaggressions are sort of remarks or statements that might seem harmless, but they are often repeated daily towards people who identify as part of these marginalized communities. And then they come up again and again in all aspects of their lives. And so from that perspective, microaggressions have a very cumulative effect. And this effect is that basically they serve as constant reminders that these individuals or members of marginalized groups are sort of less than the majority groups or those who identify as white and cis. And so some examples of this, for example, I personally identify as a woman and also as a Latina. So I have been asked, why are you a scientist? You don't look like one, sort of again, referring to this stereotype that we have of a scientist, with messy hair, lab coat, standing over a lab bench, that's very white with white hair. And then the other thing I've been told several times is, sort of, oh, you speak really good English, or like, oh, you only got that because you are the affirmative action hire, we needed to fill a quota. And so things like that can be maybe not hurtful if it's said once and, it never happens again. But if those things are talked about over and over, or said over and over, they can have a very detrimental effect. And so this happens to every group that is historically marginalized. And they reflect sort of these stereotypes that we have as a culture that can be really hard to cognitively counteract and be aware of. And so just talking about these can be helpful in sort of creating spaces that are more inclusive and that sort of move away from acting on these stereotypes that we have as a community. And so other things, go back. Yeah, so one of the things that I want to emphasize, and I'll talk about this again later, is also that if you are a member of more than one of these communities, you would be, hearing microaggressions from one identity in one space and maybe another identity or both. And so they can be very harmful. Okay, excellent. Thanks, Wendy. All right, and so what are the impacts of these microaggressions? So as I mentioned, they can be cumulative and very harmful, but what they actually do by sort of being repeated over and over again is they serve as kind of a reminder of isolation for those of us who are in marginalized groups. And it sort of invalidates our lived experiences, but also our expertise and the knowledge that we bring to certain spaces. And on top of that, it also causes us to be hypervigilant. So we're constantly aware of our surroundings. And this is particularly prominent in things like, sometimes darker skinned individuals are seen as a threat. And so like security officers might ask darker skinned individuals like why they're in an academic building in certain times of the day. And that sort of fear of being asked, why you're where you are and being seen as a threat can be very stressful to an individual, and that can lead to anxiety and depression. And so I want to also bring up the point of intersectionality. I know I mentioned this briefly in the last slide, but I want to credit Kimberly Crenshaw, who sort of coined the term intersectionality. And that was because a lot of times we tend to think about race inequality as separate from inequality that's based on other factors like gender, class, sexuality, or even immigrant status. But some people are subject to all of these. So as I mentioned, I'm a woman, I'm also Latina. And so just accounting for the fact that we hold multiple identities and can be subject to harm based on that is really important. And so to bring some numbers into this, I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality and the impact on mental health. So there's a study done in Sweden on sort of gauging the mental health impacts of low income, female gender, and foreign-born intersectionality. And foreign-born is outside of Sweden in this case. And that study showed that there's a 2.73 times higher odds of individuals who experience or identify as those intersectional identities are more likely of having depressive symptoms throughout the course of their life. There's another few studies done on the intersection of sexual orientation and gender. And those studies found that that intersectionality correlates with higher prominence of eating disorders or worse eating disorders. There's another study done on the race and gender intersectionality that found that it has more than an additive effect. So instead of, sometimes we tend to think that this can be a linear correlation of, like the race and the gender culminating in some effect on mental health. So this is more than that additive effect. And that study was done on Native American women, showing that the impact is greater for that intersectionality on mental health. And then there were another 4 studies done that found that socioeconomic status, or SES, intersection with gender had a more than additive effect as well on mental illness. And so that study was done on those studies were done on low SES women. So I want to round up this section briefly by talking a little bit about how to identify some of these microaggressions and their impact on mental health, and also work as a community on improving mental health for all of us in academia. And those, on top of sort of encouraging medical support and treatment and potentially some therapy and people to speak with, it also requires us as a community to be aware of and question the assumptions that might lead us to commit microaggressions against individuals in marginalized groups. And so that can be sort of as simple as pausing, reflecting on something you're going to say, and then thinking about, why do I hold this stereotype? Why does our society hold this stereotype? And how can I best sort of think about eliminating that stereotype or bias from my vocabulary? And like sort of that reacting mentality, and sort of pausing and maybe not reacting right away, and thinking a little bit about what you're about to say or assume. And then also just apologizing to those that you might have harmed. So it can be really hard to question your assumptions. And, this is why we have stereotypes. It's really challenging to steer clear from that mentality. And so sometimes if something happens and, you slip and you commit a microaggression, just apologize. It is very, very refreshing to hear, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was harmful. I'm learning from that mistake and I won't do it again. And so an example of this is like, I mentioned that people are like, oh, your English is so good. And something I'll respond with is like, oh, why did you think it wasn't? And then people are like, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to say that. And so and that's refreshing, because it's like, okay, yeah, that's totally fine. I understand. And so having conversations like that and feeling okay with the discomfort that comes with maybe committing that harm, and, being asked to reflect on why you said something can be very, very helpful for all of us in marginalized communities. Next slide. Okay, so generally, Wendy and I like ending with this sort of elite training comparison. And so I like thinking about the fact that, or thinking about generally in mental health and academia, is kind of like elite athletes. So the best athletes, like Serena in this photo, train really hard. They give their all to achieve their peak performance in whatever sport they're in, just like us academics sort of train to be peak performers in our fields. And when athletes have an injury, even a really small one, they address it immediately. So they sit courtside, a doctor comes to them, they take medication or put ice or whatever it is. And that's normal. It's totally fine for athletes to do that. And so us as scientists are very privileged to be able to train our minds at the highest institutions in the best fields and contribute to the new knowledge of our world. Yet with our minds, which is where all of that awesomeness comes from, when our mind is injured or strained, we tend to just keep pushing through it. And so it's really important to not do that, to maybe pause and seek help and see what is going to be best for my mental health and for me to be able to continue contributing science to society. And some studies show that even people who don't seek help right away wait 6 to 8 years. And so again, I'll reiterate what Dr. Ingram has said. We are so excited to be having this conversation and starting to destigmatize mental illness and just be able to get help for the academics who are really struggling with their work. And so I'll pass it back over to Wendy to close us out with some data.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stachl. And I always love data, but I do want to use as much of the last 15 minutes that we have for Q&A. So I'll just put up a quick couple of word clouds from some of the free response answers in the survey from your own community. And I asked, what is the barrier? What's the main thing stopping you from seeking mental health care when you need it? And as you can see here, stigma was abundantly, not the only thing, but the biggest issue. And I also asked the question, what helps when you are struggling? And here you just see the diversity of answers people had, but central to that word cloud too, the most frequently used word was talk to your friends, talk to mental health providers, get therapy, talk to others. And that's really the important piece. So I want to invite all of you to start talking. And unfortunately, since we're doing this in a webinar format, I can't ask you to unmute yourselves, but please put questions in the Q&A box, and we're going to have some of those read aloud in the time that we have left. So I also, while we're filling in those questions, do we have any right off the bat?
We do not. So
oh man,
please.
A quiet group. My goodness,
Yep.
There's 250 people at the peak of this. How are there no questions?
We love questions.
Well, while people are thinking of your
shy.
questions and putting those in, please ask us questions. I will invite you to join us at Dragonfly in these endeavors. And even if you're too shy to put in some questions in the Q&A box here, please go ahead and maybe you'd like to join us in a much more intimate, small setting. The Dragonfly Cafe, which I mentioned, are Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 10 a.m. Pacific and 7 p.m. Central European time. And so you can go to our website or go to this tiny URL, dragonfly-cafe-live, and sign up for our, in order to get the link for that. Or come to us at our website and join us as a volunteer, or check it out. Join our newsletter, and we can only make mental health better together. So it looks like there's more questions now.
The Q&As are popping up, and just another reminder that from 5 to 6, both Dr. Ingram and Stachl will facilitate a theme table. Okay, take it away, Nicole.
Very special guest, Dr. Richard Harland, will be joining us for that.
Oh,
so
excellent.
Please come join us.
Nicole, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And Wendy, I was really astounded by the statistics that you had from our own society survey, that clearly this is a topic that we are all aware about, but maybe need to be better informed and clearly need to take some action. And Graciela, thank you so much for bringing this to the society, to the conference today. So the first question from Becky is, what resources do you have for dealing with burnout, especially following or during the pandemic?
Really good point. Yeah. So we actually just released a talk specifically on burnout, and we just designed it and drew from some of the most recent evidence that was about burnout due to the pandemic, which complicates things that normally the older research doesn't touch on. And so that is a resource that is available for free online. You can find it on our playlist, actually, on our Dragonfly YouTube channel. So that's a resource. And I can also provide maybe some more links and things like that through the conference, and make sure that those are available too. But Chrissy, you also focus on burnout quite a bit, especially as it relates to stress during the pandemic. Do you have an answer or some more ideas for that too?
Few practical tips to add on to, and I think some of these are covered actually in that YouTube video that Wendy just mentioned. But yeah, taking a break, even if it's just a weekend off, like take a weekend, don't look at your computer, sleep, binge watch TV if you want, but just don't open your email. So just taking a break is really, really helpful for sort of like resetting and relaxing. I love the idea of having a gratitude journal. That's something I personally do. And it's something that helps sort of shift the perspective off of like all the things you have to do to focusing on some of the things that you're grateful for and that really benefit you day to day. And so that's just really like physically writing out in a journal, like a few things every night that you're grateful for. That can sort of help the mentality shift. And yeah, we can share more resources just to save some time for more questions, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, so there's a series of questions that are coming up, which was something on my mind as well as both a PI and also somebody who has suffered from mental health issues. What the question is, several parts. What are some of the best mechanisms to improve the environment in a department, or you could also say in a research lab, that is always performance reward driven? And then several people are also asking, oops, I'm lost this questions, 1 minute. Somebody was asking, how do I disclose my mental health struggles with my supervisor? Or how do I begin the conversations to destigmatize mental well-being efforts? So those sort of all go together.
Yeah, I really love that you threaded those together because they do relate to one another and they involve engagement at all career levels. So if you're the one who has the lab, you can set the tone. You get really a lot of ability and leeway, and whether you want it or think you deserve it or not, you really are the one who has a lot of power and there's going to be a lot of intimidation factor coming from your students, your lab mates, the technicians that are in your lab. Even postdocs will, always defer to the PI, even if you're a junior PI, but especially if you're a very senior PI. And so setting the tone by finding out what are the local resources for mental health and what are those numbers, and getting printouts from the counseling and psychological services and having that on your door or having that up next to all the other things that are things that people should know about in the area. There's also a way to emphasize positive, just this kind of all passive stuff to start out with, but setting the tone and creating the sense that this is a safe space to disclose, to talk about. You're not going to be judged. We're going to help you. We're going to talk to you about it. We're going to support you if you do have an issue. And so another thing that's really amazing, a great resource is these posters by a mental health advocate and chemistry person who is a PhD in chemistry, Zoe Ares. And so Zoe is this amazing advocate who and graphic designer who created a whole series of posters. So when I hand it over to Chrissy, I will go find a link for that information, but that is a really wonderful way to post things up around your lab, the space that you have control over, that indicate to people very clearly and consistently without having to belabor the point or be invasive, to let them know that it's safe to talk about these things, that you're aware of it and that you want to know more and you want to be supportive. And then for the students that are worried about that and disclosing, and maybe their PI hasn't done these things and hasn't brought it up, in lab group meeting of feeling stressed themselves and what they do about it, and taking breaks and talking about both positive of acknowledging they've had their own struggles, as well as indicating what they do about it in order to make things better. It's that two piece, not just I'm so stressed all the time and that's just the way it is. It's really, really good for PIs and for people in the higher level positions to model self-care and model getting the care that they need in order to be the best scientist and researcher and mentor that they possibly can. So if your PI hasn't done that, or you haven't been around long enough to get a sense of whether they're a safe person to come out to or not about a struggle that maybe you need a little more time off on Wednesday afternoons to go see your therapist, then that's something that you can start touching the waters on. Talk to other people, drop maybe a thing in conversation about your friend who had depression, or mention the video you saw, or that you attended this seminar, and like, say, you know, broach the subject as opposed to just dive right in and say and expose that you have a diagnosed mental illness. It can be very, very intimidating to do so. And I understand that completely. I myself have bipolar disorder, and I disclosed to one of my mentors during grad school, but I didn't disclose to the other, not because I didn't necessarily think it was safe, but I didn't have to, so I never did. Now he knows, but it's everybody knows, but it's something that is very, very intimidating as a student. And so it really is beneficial for PIs and for people in those power positions to actively make sure that they are creating a safe space and culture. So Chrissy, ideas?
Yes, I have a couple of things to add, but I just wanted to reiterate what Wendy just said about sort of the power that PIs have. And I actually, as part of my own research, I have some data showing that one of the biggest sort of like stressors of faculty is that they don't have the resources to help their students and don't know where to find them. And so like, that is a statistic that exists. And so I think it's really important just to highlight that a lot of faculty feel that way, and then sort of seek out ways to find the resources on campus, maybe in the department or in the college or in the university, and sort of guide, like collect those resources and be able to give them to your students or trainees. So all of the things that Wendy said fall into that category. But then on top of that, I want to hit on this piece about sort of the merit-driven aspects of academia. I also, there's a lot of data showing the fact that, you know, people are sort of leaving the academic tracks more readily, mostly because we are training more PhDs than there are academic jobs. And there's just a plethora of opportunities for people post-PhD. And so one of the things that I've seen in my own research about graduate students and postdocs and their needs and wants for their career outcomes is that they want to go into things like industry, consulting, starting their own companies, etc. And having conversations and setting expectations between those trainees and faculty just to sort of set the tone for what those milestones should be in their training can alleviate a lot of that stress from like publishing all the papers you can and like constantly writing and constantly producing academic level work if their career opportunities or career desires are not in academia. And so be happy to talk more about that in our session later today. But I think it's really important to highlight that that stress comes from the sort of assumption that a lot of us want to stay in academia, and that's not always accurate. So I hope that is helpful.
So to follow up, Chrissy, with that, for those who have been diagnosed with a neurodivergent disease, what do you suggest in terms of combating this ableism and prejudice in academia?
Yeah, so things like this to just open the space to make sure that we're talking about those like diseases and disorders and all of this and reducing that stigma, I think is probably the biggest thing. And I love like having data and relying on that data to open up conversations about these issues in academia. And so that can be at a very local level. It can be sort of like, let's do a survey in a community, see how many people are really struggling with even just being honest about the things that they struggle with, and then having a discussion about that. And that can be anonymous and just like, you know, how Wendy did the slides about the community we're in right now, and showing those data just to start the conversation. But it can be really intimidating. And I think one of the things that has helped me and a couple of my friends is going to like an anonymous person on campus, for example, like an ombuds person or something, and getting some suggestions for how to initiate those conversations with your advisor or your colleagues or peers. But a lot of it just has to do with that sort of stigma reduction. So I, again, love that we're in this space, and I think we need to create this opportunity for more communities so that it does become more normal.
So how does somebody go about starting that conversation, both from the person who's disclosing perhaps a struggle, or for a supervisor to begin that conversation in a destigmatized way?
So one of the resources that we also offer and recommend, one that we offer is active listening training within the academic setting. And so active listening training can be specifically for faculty, or we can design it, or we have a version of it that's more for trainees. It really involves learning some basic skills, but then applying them and practicing with them in a setting that makes sense in this space. And so active listening training is a workshop that we at Dragonfly do offer. So reach out to us. We would be happy to work with you to bring it to your campus, or to facilitate maybe an online or free open one. We're open access, so we want all of our skills and options available to others. And then the other piece would be, that's a free online resource that is similar but not specific to academia, is psychological first aid training. And so in the Coursera courses, there's one that's produced by Johns Hopkins, and psychological first aid. And it's a phenomenal series that allows for training. And we have all of our Dragonfly ambassadors, anybody who is a volunteer with us that delivers programs like this, we ask them to take that full training on there. And it is just a phenomenal resource for getting more familiar with how do you speak to someone compassionately and competently, as well as protecting your own space and knowing your own barriers, and not putting yourself into positions that you are uncomfortable or unable to fill that role. You're not playing the role of psychologist. Nobody wants you to. So if you're the student, you should be the student. If you're a PI, you are the PI and the supervisor in academic way, but you can engage in these conversations with compassion and competency. But it's like anything else. It's like the first time you pick up a pipette, you're not the best pipetter in the world. So we have to learn and practice these skills.
Unfortunately, we've come to an end, and this is a time symposia. Everybody may want a 30-minute break, but please join Dr. Stachl and Ingram and Harlan, one of our better developmental biologists, in theme table number 8. And yes, we'll try to save all the questions, and we will give them to both panelists, so then they can provide answers to each of your questions. So if your question was not answered, do not worry, they will get the text. And thank you both very much. It's been great. And thank you, Nicole.